This morning we'll be looking over, really kind of starting off as we look forward towards Easter and looking at Jesus. Who is Jesus? And we've gone through over the last a couple months, looking at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7, and wonderful teachings. Teachings that we would agree with and we desire and we need more like that, right? But who is Jesus? Is he only a good teacher? And really that question, Jesus, who is he, is really something I want to look at over the next few weeks leading up to Easter. So many people, or when we hear that word Jesus, what comes to our mind? For all of us, something comes to our mind. And it could be, you've never heard of him, although I would say every person in this room has heard the name of Jesus. So when we hear that name, something comes to our mind. Now, some use it as a swear word. Others, we've heard him, about him, we've had a personal relationship, and he's changed our life. This past week, I was at the park, and there was probably at least 10 young teenagers, and we had a conversation, and they asked me where I was from, and I told them I'm British. They didn't believe me. My speech betrays me. I do have British citizenship now, but they know. It's an add-on, right? And so they asked me, why did you come here? And I told them to tell people about Jesus. What do you think their response was? Oh, he's just a fable. There wasn't really a person, Jesus. Well, then the conversation continued on about God, and there is no God. There is no proof of God. So I took out my phone, and I showed him my phone, and I said, did this phone have a maker? Somebody that designed it and created it? Well, yeah. Well, how do you know? Well, obviously, the phone is right there. I said, the universe is proof that there is somebody who created it and designed it. And you know, so many times we want to just push things off because maybe we've heard certain things. But yet when you actually stop and think and consider, there is far more proof all around us that there is a God who has created all things than that there is no God. But going back to the question about Jesus, I did mention to them, any true historian that knows history knows that Jesus was a living man who walked on this earth. You cannot go throughout history and try to say that was all just some made-up story. Historians, even Josephus, during the time, just not too long, within a century after Jesus lived here on this earth, a Jewish historian wrote and described, it's not just what's recorded in the scriptures, but so many historians have spoken. So it's not about if Jesus existed or not. The real question comes, who was he? And why did he come? Now, as I mentioned over the last few weeks, we've looked at the Sermon on the Mount, and he was a brilliant teacher. The people flocked to him. The people clung to the words that he said, and they said he speaks as one that has authority. But over the next few weeks, I want to look more at who he is. And he was more than just a good teacher. In fact, there are many people who just thought that's all he was. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, he was enamored by Jesus. But what he did is he cut out all of the pieces that he liked and created his own Bible. It's often called the Thomas Jefferson Bible, but I believe the official title was the life, Jesus' life and moral teachings, or the life and moral teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. That was the official title. And what he did is he or cut out all of the pieces about Jesus' life and his teachings, but he removed anything that showed any miracles or the resurrection or pointed to Jesus as being divine. He just wanted Jesus to be a good moral philosopher and nothing more. But how would that have helped us today? Now, as we continue in Matthew, and that's what we'll be looking at, Matthew's perspective of Jesus, we'll continue on the very next chapter after the Sermon on the Mount. And just a little introduction about Matthew himself. If you wanted, later on, you could look at Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9 through 12, and that is where Jesus meets Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. Now, nobody likes taxes, but during the time of Jesus, it wasn't just about somebody collecting taxes. This was a Jew working for the Roman government who taxed the Jewish people, and not only taxed the money for the Roman government, but they could add on whatever they wanted to. And when I think of a tax collector, just think of the sheriff of Nottingham, right, in Robin Hood. Just going around and taxing the people and taxing the people and taxing the people, and people despised him, right? And that is almost the tax collectors during Jesus' day. He was an outcast. He was despised and rejected by his people because, well, he was you could say a legal thief. Legal in the sense of Rome, but he was a thief taking from the people of the Jews. And that was his background. But Jesus called him to follow him. Now, this morning we'll be looking at the miracles of Jesus. Right after Matthew records about the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 8 and 9 are filled with miracle after miracle after miracle of what Jesus did. Incredible miracles. Jesus calming the storm. Jesus casting out demons out of the demon-possessed men that no man could contain or control. He forgives and heals a paralyzed man. He restores life to a young girl. He heals blind men. And just over and over, just the power of Jesus. But that's not how Matthew starts about all of the miracles. Matthew begins with very personal and individual miracles in lives of people who would have been considered as outcasts. In chapter 8, in verse 1, it says, "When he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.' Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, 'I am willing. Be cleansed.' Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, 'See that you tell no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priests, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them.'" The very first one we see is Jesus. He comes down the mountain, and in one sense, as you look at the different gospel records, Matthew, this is the first one that Matthew records, the first individual miracle. Now, if you were to look at the end of chapter 4, it mentions that Jesus had done many miracles and many wonderful works. So it wasn't the first one that Jesus did. It wasn't the first one that the others recorded, but it is the first one that Matthew chose to record. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a contradiction between the different gospel writers. If you and I witnessed the same event and wrote down the details afterwards, I'm sure there would be some differences. Me being an American, me maybe having some construction or painting background, or being a pastor, I may see events through a different lens. But you, from your background, your upbringing, your occupation, you may see different events. And not only the background, but also the audience that they're trying to communicate to. Matthew's audience, his primary audience, was a Jewish audience, steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures, that knew and understood the Hebrew Scriptures. And when we come to the leprosy was the most distraught, or the disease that was really the worst of the worst in their eyes. So often it was considered linked with sin. And the thought and the idea, if you were a leper, you must have done something to allow that to happen. We even see that Miriam, Moses' sister, Gehazi, the servant, and certain people who committed certain sins, and the judgment or the punishment was leprosy. But that didn't mean that every leprosy was because or a direct result of sin or that individual sin. But as we think about leprosy, it was an awful disease. It spread throughout the body. The oral law, it mentioned that you had to stay at least 2 meters away from others. Downwind, if you were upwind from somebody else, you had to stay at least 100 cubits, about 150 feet from that person. They had to wear a covering over their mouth. Now, in one sense, it starts sounding like COVID, right? 5 years down the road. It's amazing. But remember that time? And it was almost like unclean, unclean. Every person was unclean, even though, whether you had it or not. And we all had to stay 2 meters from each other. We all had to cover our mouths. And if you saw somebody walking on your side of the street, either you walked to the other side of the street or they crossed the street, right? And it was almost as though we all had a plague. Well, back then, that is how that individual would have lived with the leprosy. They would have been quarantined outside of the town. Luke, the historian and the physician who wrote the gospel according to Luke, he says this man was full of leprosy. It wasn't just like one spot or one area, but his body was covered with leprosy. So often, it was viewed that the leprosy would cause great wounds on a person's body. And they would lose whether it's fingers or limbs. But more recent study recognized it wasn't actually the leprosy that caused the wounds. One of the interesting things about leprosy, most diseases are dreaded because of the pain and the suffering that it causes. Leprosy was different. It wasn't about the pain. It was about the numbness that it caused. It killed the nerves. And so there was one study of the doctor who was studying leprosy. He said he went to unlock a door and the key wouldn't turn. And a young boy who had leprosy walked up and said, "Oh, I'll do that for you." And he quickly jolted the key and unlocked the door. And the doctor thought, how could this young boy be able to turn the key when I couldn't? Until he looked down and saw blood dripping down on the floor. And he saw the finger was cut right on through to the bone from the key. And yet the boy couldn't feel it. Many people went blind, not because of the leprosy, but because, well, some of the studies this man had found was because people washing their face with scalding water and yet couldn't feel it. And so it wasn't just the leprosy that caused the disfigurement, but without feeling the pain when they bumped into things or picking up hot things or cutting themselves, and they couldn't feel it. In one sense, you could say the next time you feel pain, think it is a blessing, right? It's a warning saying, stop, don't do that. But they didn't have that. But as you think about somebody who was full of leprosy, in the Jewish law, the only thing worse than touching a leper was touching a dead person. because it would cause you to become unclean. And this man comes to Jesus. He had heard about him. He had heard about the miracles that he had performed for other people. He probably had heard some of the teaching that Jesus had taught and the compassion about Jesus. But notice as he comes to Jesus, what he mentions in verse 2. It says, and behold, a leper came and worshiped him. He bowed down. He showed reverence to Jesus. And he says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Think about those words. He didn't say, if you are able, will you make me clean? He said, if you are willing, you can make me clean. He knew Jesus had the power to cleanse him, to heal him. But he says, are you willing? You know, when I think about that, this man would have been met with rejection over and over again. As soon as people saw him, they would have walked to the other side. There were some rabbis, some writings. One rabbi said if he knew that a leper was on a street, he would not even buy an egg from anyone on that street. It was the fear, the dread, the disease that people would shun, try to stay away from as much as possible. And any person that had it, it was the dreaded plague. And this man, he comes to Jesus and really recognizes he's at the mercy of Jesus. I know you are able. Are you willing? And you know, as he came to Jesus, because of the reverence that he showed, because of the way he requested, I would assume this man kept that 2-meter distance according to the law. He probably did bow down at somewhat of a distance. But what is amazing here is Jesus' response. Jesus didn't keep that 2-meter distance. It says, then Jesus put out his hand and touched him. Now, imagine if you were one of the disciples there, or any one of the multitude. Remember, if you touched a leper, you were supposed to be quarantined for a number of days. You were considered unclean. But Jesus, it wasn't about the crowd. It wasn't about the disciples. He looked at this man, walked up to him, and touched him. It was probably the first time this man had ever been touched since he had been a leper. And he says, I am willing. Be cleansed. Think, it wasn't just about the power that Jesus had. It wasn't just about the teaching and the compassion that he had showed. But all of that compassionate teaching, he was now living. It was the way he lived. And immediately, his leprosy was cleansed. In one sense, you could say many people viewed the leprosy of the man would have caused someone who touched him to become unclean. But because of Jesus' holiness and his power, it caused this man to be cleansed. And Jesus told him, see that you tell no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Jesus, he wasn't breaking the law. He wasn't breaking the Hebrew Scriptures, but instead, he actually tells this man, I want you to go and follow exactly what the Hebrew Scriptures has told you to do. The Jewish law, if somebody was healed, they were to go to the priest. The priest would then inspect and declare them as clean. He says, I want you to go and offer up. Don't go to the countryside and tell everybody what has happened. I want you to go directly to the priest. But it was to be a testimony of what Jesus had done. Now, as Matthew continues, he meets somebody else who would have been despised by the Jews. Verse 5, it says, "Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, 'Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented.'" Now, as a Jew would have been reading this, first it would have been the leprosy that would have caught him off guard. And Jesus actually touching a leper, I can't believe that he would have done that. And the very next person that arrives was not a Jew, but it was a Gentile. Not just any Gentile, but a Roman centurion, a leader, a general in the Roman army, who once again would have been despised by the Jews. But this man comes to Jesus, pleading with him, asking, because his servant, who, according to Luke, mentions this servant was dear to him. He was sick and ready to die. As Matthew records, he mentions he was paralyzed. He couldn't get up. They couldn't even bring him out to Jesus, but he's back home. And he says, "Please, help." In verse 7, "And Jesus said to him, 'I will come and heal him.'" Jesus says, "Okay, I'll come along. I'll come with you. I'll come to your house. I'll heal the man." Now, once again, just as the touching of a leper was considered unclean, the entering into a Gentile's home was also considered unclean. But that was not going to stop Jesus. But it did stop the centurion. The centurion says, whoa. No, I can't allow that. The very next verse, it says, the centurion answered and said, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof." This centurion, he had lived there for a while. The other gospel records mention that he was well respected in the community. He understood the Jewish laws. He understood the Jewish customs. He knew that it was not according to the customs of the Jews to enter into a Gentile's home. And he says, "No, I am not worthy for you to come into my house." Now, in one sense, the centurion, by the power of Rome, he could have forced Jesus to come into his house. But he knew there was something different about Jesus. He also knew he didn't deserve the healing from Jesus. But what Matthew goes on and records about this Roman soldier was the faith this Roman soldier had. After he said, "I am not worthy that you should come under my roof," he says, "But only speak a word, and my servant will be healed." The first miracle Jesus actually touched when he didn't have to, and it would have been considered unclean. The second miracle that Matthew records, this Gentile says, you don't have to be present in order for it to happen. Why did he have so much faith in Jesus? Verse 9, because he says, "I know something about myself." He says, "For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes. And to another, 'Come,' and he comes. To my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." What's he saying? I am under the power and authority of Rome. And I can tell my servants, "Go and do this." And they do it. And when they go out, they accomplish exactly what I have said. Rome does not have to be present. Caesar does not have to be present in order for the task to be accomplished. Because of the authority that I am under, I speak with authority. I don't have to be present for the actions to carry out. And what he was recognizing is Jesus was sent by authority and had authority. And just as the centurion could speak the word and it could take place, he recognized Jesus had more authority given to him than even the authority of Rome. And all Jesus had to do was speak, and it would happen. Now, why is Matthew drawing this attention? Well, the very next verse, in verse 10, it says, when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that same hour. Matthew is intentionally recording this, because as Jesus pointed out, he says, I have not seen such great faith in all of Israel. In fact, notice those words. It says, he marveled. He was astonished. He was shocked. There is only 2 instances where it mentions about Jesus marveling. And you know what those 2 instances are? One is this Gentile having faith in who Jesus was. And the other one, in Mark chapter 6 and verse 6, it was the disbelief of the Jews in his own town who knew the Hebrew Scriptures, who knew all of the promises of the Messiah who would come, but did not believe. Both of them were in regards to faith. One who had so much knowledge, but no faith. The other, probably not a whole lot of knowledge, but he had tremendous faith in who Jesus was. And as Jesus describes in verse 11, he says, there will be many from the east and west. He's speaking beyond Israel. The Gentiles from around the world who will sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. He says there's going to be many Gentiles from all around the world who follow after me, who put their faith and trust in me. But he gives that declaration. He says, but the sons of the kingdom. He's speaking about those Jews. The ones who thought that they were part of the kingdom. He said, will be cast out into outer darkness. And this was, in a sense, a warning to the Jews, the Jewish audience who was reading this message from Matthew. Now, if we continue on and we see that, he says, go your way as you have believed, so let it be done for you. In that same hour, his servant was healed. Now, the very next, we'll just read down through a few more verses in closing. It says, now when Jesus had come into Peter's house, it was right there in Capernaum, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she arose and served them. When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. And he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, he himself took our infirmities and bore our sickness. Now, as we read through these first few verses of Matthew chapter 8, Matthew is trying to help us recognize he's more than just the teacher that we've heard about in Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7. Great, wonderful moral teachings. But he has a desire to touch individuals' lives. He has a desire to change the lives of those who are outcast, whose lives have been deformed, who In every area of life, hope has been gone. And even as when you think about the centurion, he had power, he had wealth, and yet he recognized he had limits. Every human being, no matter how much power or wealth they may have, every single one of us have limits. A wall in which we can no longer go, we cannot go further. But yet Jesus, there is no limit. And as we consider these passages, where are we in our life? Who do we see Jesus as? Over the next few weeks, we'll see he is more than just a healer. He's more than a teacher. He's more than just somebody who performed miracles. Why did he do these miracles? It wasn't to prove who he was. Well, one of the things that we talked about this past week at the Know What, Know Why. It was to authenticate who he was. It was to show and reveal he is more than just a teacher. He is more than just a man. But he had come by the power and the authority of the Father to make a difference in our lives. And as we look over the next few weeks, he went to the cross. And the greatest miracle was when he rose from the dead himself. And as we think about our lives, where do we fit in the story? Could be the weak leper. Lord, if you're willing, I know you can make me heal. You can heal me if you're willing. And we see Jesus says, I am willing. Be cleansed. Maybe the centurion who once again knew he was not worthy, but requests Jesus for the healing of his servant. And Jesus recognized his faith. And he says, I will heal him. Jesus invites us to himself to know that personal healing, not just the physical, but the greatest healing is the spiritual. And that was what all of these physical miracles constantly pointed to, the spiritual healing that Jesus would offer.